watch now or later. So today we're going to meet the Open Data Services Cooperative team face-to-face. I think this is the first time we had a chance to do that. And we will hear sort of about the entire upgrade cycle as we have it planned through the first quarter. We'll do just an overview. And then answer any questions about that process. And then we'll sort of step back and look specifically at what's happening over the next month in the sort of first phase of that process. And first, we'll start with a round of introductions. I expect mostly this conversation is just going to be a chance for us to just meet each other and hear about this in real time. We might surface some important issues, and we'll just sort of like have them set on the agenda for the path moving forward. So y'all know me, but I think there's some new folks on the call that haven't met each other. So let's hear first from Andrew and Devin.
Hi, everyone. It's Andrew Benson. I'm the former Executive Director of Ontario 211 Services. During my time with Ontario 211 Services, I would say led the Open Data Initiative from the perspective of trying to consolidate all of the 211 data in Ontario, but also led a national initiative through United Way Canada to consolidate data into, whether it be open data or an open system or shared repository. Essentially, we're trying to get to the same place where we had a consolidated place of data for the purposes of essentially expanding 211 service to all of Canada. Last thing I'll mention is very recently we've worked closely with iCarol and specifically with Neil McKechnie and Ben Tran from iCarol to the HSDS schema. We call it HSDS Plus, so we don't confuse with any versioning of the HSDS, but we implemented a upgraded version of HSDS and have implemented that to build a database which we now use for the purposes of a public search portal. And more importantly, probably for this group, we are just actually within the last couple of days proceeding with a API on top of the HSDS database in Ontario for the purpose of being able to expand use of the data in Ontario and across Canada.
Awesome. And I see Neil has also joined us. So Neil, let's hear from you and then we'll hear from Devin. Just an introduction. Or if Neil is still getting situated, maybe we'll hear from Devin first.
Hi, yeah, I'm Devin. I'm the president of the Sahana Software Foundation. We produce, I guess, the world's most popular open source information management system for disasters and humanitarian aid use cases. You know, I've been a fan of this project for a while, and I think I'm most interested in of applying a service directory, this service directory model, to spreadsheets and particularly the Airtable data, kind of like spreadsheet-based data management system, so that it's easy for groups to organize humanitarian service data in a more ad hoc, kind of like case by case, instance by instance, event by event basis. So it's something that volunteers could use or people in the field could use to kind of collect information quickly and have it be in a standardized format that would allow them to do more interesting things with it. That's it for me. I think, unless there's something I should add.
That's great, Devin. I'll also add that Devin worked last year with the Digital Humanitarian Network to develop a flat version of the Open Referral spec, the Humanitarian Services Data Model, something that could fit into a spreadsheet. And so that's also something that we might be reconsidering when we pick back up. So it sounds like Neil is working to get his microphone working. So Neil, unless you're ready, let's see if we can hear from the Open Data Services team and we can loop back to you. Tim and Rob, you want to kick us off?
We can't hear you, Tim.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Great. So my name is Tim Davies. I'm part of the Open Data Services team. And I guess our kind of origins were working on a data standard called Places to Go, Things to Do, Plings, which was all around kind of community resource directory work. So when we came into touch with Greg and the work of Open Referral, it felt like a great way to kind of connect back to some of the roots we'd had in exploring that. Right now, we spend a lot of our time working on incubating open data standards, so working with standards often during their early stages of trying to put together both the technology and the support for implementation. And particularly, I do a lot of work around helping the governance of development processes. How do we model and improve data models from their early versions into kind of stable versions, which is what we've been doing with Open Referral, trying to take what started as multiple sources of information about what the standard was from Google Docs and GitHub Markdown files and data packages, and we're halfway through, I would say, a process of reconciling all of that into the kind of authoritative model of what HSDS is, and as part of that, also gathering all these inputs about what it needs to be. So I'm really keen to hear more about the HSDS Plus and kind of how it's been extended, and so on. And I guess yeah, some of that's been about building documentation off the schemas so that we have a single source of truth about what the standard says. And a lot of work we've done on other standards has been about building the mechanisms to help manage those community extensions. So that may be something we want to explore with HSDS as well, of how can you have a core standard, but also adaptations and contextualizations of that for different use cases.
My name's Rob. I work with Tim at Open Data Services. My background's in product management, so I've been trying to apply some of that to Open Referral, just working through the process of the Miami project that's brought us in, and working on the upgrade process and getting everything together to do the for the HSDS upgrade, and especially looking at some of the tooling. I've been doing a lot of work with the HANA API and helping a small team that Greg's put together work on upgrades to that and tooling around front ends for that.
All right, Neil, do we have you back in with a microphone, or should we get your introduction by chat?
I don't know. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Great. So quick introduction, Neil McKechnie. I am the CTO of Charity Logic, which offers iCarol. We describe it as helpline software, but for this call, it's more useful to think of it as information referral software, because our clients all over the world use it to curate resource databases, community, human and social service providers. And we have got, it's in the many hundreds of clients. So we represent a good chunk of the formal INR market in the US and Canada. All of the 201s in Canada, about 40–42% of those in the US. And beyond those, we've got quite a number of other clients that are, I wouldn't call them informal information referral entities, but rather they're just not necessarily as well structured as you'd find a 201 to be, but still do information referral to their clients. Crisis centers, suicide prevention, medical or health-related, epilepsy, Down syndrome, all these kinds of issues tend to have one or more helplines serving their populations, and they reached us also to use our software to help them curate these databases.
All right, cool. I am going to share, I actually pulled up a previous notes document, and I've just been, my computer's very slow, so my notes are very meager, but I'm chatting that into the field. We've got some minutes. If you're having any trouble, you should either be able to chat your question or suggest something here in this document, and we can get to it. So let me put out a quick agenda, and then we can let Tim and Rob sort of talk a little bit about what the work that they've been doing and see if there are any questions. So I want to give just a little bit more introduction to what we're doing in Miami, and some context into how we're viewing the path from HSDS 1.0 currently to HSDS 1.1 and beyond. And then we can talk a little bit about the specific issues that might be popping up as we get started. So first, I'll just introduce the Miami project, and then I'll kick it to Tim. So Switchboard of Miami, which is now undergoing an organizational transition, we're working with their funder, the Children's Trust of Miami, to essentially do a pilot project in which we'll be publishing their information via an open API. We're using Ohana as a test bed. We're using that to both test the effectiveness of HSDS and Ohana, and also do some business modeling to generate insights around how open data can actually be a sustainable business strategy. I'm leading the team in Miami. We have some local folks contracted on that project, and also we've contracted with the Open Data Services Co-op to lead the implementation on extracting data from the existing 2-on-1 system, transforming it into HSDS, loading it into Ohana. So they're learning a little bit about the peculiarities of the Miami 2-on-1, but also they're generating insights about the domain and about the feasibility for HSDS. And so that's some backdrop from to the work that we're now going to hear about, which is upgrading the HSDS from 1.0. That includes, as Tim sort of suggested, improving the documentation and addressing some inconsistencies in the schema, and also identifying the things that we're going to do between now and like version 1.1, as well as starting to chart the process to 2.0. So that's the deep background. I'm happy to answer any questions about the Miami implementation if you have them, but I just as soon kick it to Open Data Services Co-op and hear from them about that process. So Tim, maybe you can tell us a little bit about what you've done so far, and then I have a framework of criteria for what is going into how we're doing that triage to identify what should happen in version 1.1. But why don't you walk us right up to that point, and then I can dig back in.
Yeah, so essentially, I think most of you will have seen that now we've moved the documentation to docs.openreferral.org in our kind of, so there was one markdown file that was all the documentation, and Rob, Ben, and others in the team have now moved that so that the documentation is generated from the data package JSON kind of file, so that we have one place where definitions sit, because previously we had a definitions table of terminology and effectively a schema in the data package JSON, and then other bits of documentation in the markdown, and we're trying to get towards making sure all those are well aligned, because we also had the database diagram, and none of those things perfectly matched up in what they said the standard says. What you'll find we've now got in the issue tracker on GitHub is quite a lot of things marked as 1.0 tidy up, things that we still need to kind of reconcile and work out what was intended by the original documentation, where there have been conflicts, and I think Neil, you've particularly given us some pointers already on places we might not have got that quite right, or where there's things that still need working out on what the original schema, what the original spec intended. And our hope is by the time we finish that process very, very early next year, we have a very clear sense of this is exactly what HSDS currently says, so we know what we're modifying and updating and changing, and then we have a controlled change process from there on. So all those things which, as I've gone back through the issues that were open already, that looked like they weren't settled matters, and I've had to do a bit of archaeology, and everyone's comments from 2015 have been really useful here. But some things seem to me that they weren't settled, they weren't decided on for the current version. We've marked all of those as 1.1, and the idea is there that we need to come towards a proposal for what should change. And what we try and do in any standard update process is get the discussion going, but then move as quickly as we can to a proposal of what should change. So at least there's a straw man there that we can see, is that the change we want to see in terms, for example, of the language handling of phone numbers, or some of the information around what becomes maybe just a free text field rather than a normalized table, some of those changes that might happen. Our sense is at the moment that the current kind of adoption of HSDS means we could afford some maybe non-backwards compatible changes in 1.1. Normally you'd try and avoid that in a kind of 0.1 upgrade. But I think as far as we can see, and again, really keen to be corrected if this is wrong, there aren't many kind of full implementations of HSDS as the spec says, because the spec's been slightly ambiguous up until now. So, obviously in a 1.1 we would aim for nothing that's kind of radical changing of the model completely, but there might be some things that aren't fully backwards compatible we're considering there. And yeah, Greg can talk more on the timelines that we're aiming for, but we're trying to then tag all of those issues on GitHub, and from there come to proposals. And then with anything, the method we're always aiming to do is consider what's the impact of that proposal on anyone producing data. So does this match with how data exists within systems like iCarol, what we're learning from the Miami data, what we're learning from the kind of data that Devin's talking about that people want to collect ad hoc in spreadsheets. Does this model make their lives easier and work well for existing data? And crucially, what's the business logic you would use when consuming that data? Because I think our experience is so often standards miss out on that piece of saying, well, how do you interpret this, and is this easy to interpret? So for example, I think taxonomies are a really interesting one there, where we know that advanced referral systems are capable of dealing with some quite complex taxonomies. What do we want to do in the standards so that both a relatively naive and simple handling of that data, where someone's maybe just looking to filter columns, can make sense of whatever we say about taxonomies without us losing the expressive need that there is for those more complex systems. So with any of those issues and those proposals, we've got to evaluate them against data supply and against user need, and then stage proposals. The other nice thing the documentation site allows us to do, I believe, and correct me if I'm wrong, Rob, is to kind of stage future versions. So we can start working up a future version, see what it would look like before it goes live. And we can also keep that version history, so that at the moment 1.1 is there, you can still go back and look at 1.0 and see the differences. So I think, is that what you're aiming for, Greg? Does that cover kind of what you wanted?
Yes, I think so. I'll pause here to see if folks have questions right off the bat. Some of your questions we may sort of like just put on the agenda for in a bit, because I do want to talk a little bit about our criteria for making decisions about what we address in 1.1 versus what we defer on. But let me see what questions folks might have.
Greg, it's Andrew, and Tim, thank you for that. The Open Data Services team then, is there a role beyond that in a contract position for the Miami project, or are you having some sort of work or role in the development of the standard going forward?
I can take this. So we've contracted Open Data Services to deliver on the local Miami implementation, and I have deputized them, and they're going. This is sort of within the scope of the contract, but they are going beyond the scope, really to an extent on a volunteer basis. To make sure that the learning that they're having from Miami is synthesized with what you've all done out there in a new iteration of the spec. I do expect that we will have to find additional funding to make sure that that leadership continues from version 1.1 to 2.0, but also more importantly, we're going to work with them during this period to develop proposals for governance that actually go to this working group at the Open Referral community level.
Okay, the reason I'm asking is I'm not clear as to whether sort of my participation or contribution is within the scope of the project or within the scope of developing the standards. I'm hoping the latter.
Go ahead, Tim.
Yeah, so I was going to say, yeah, no, I see the role we're playing with respect to the standard is helping with some of the stewardship of this process. And I see this call as within the scope of HSDS as a shared kind of resource. As Greg says, we've got to keep working on evolving the governance of it so that its nature as a shared resource continues to deepen. Because I think, yeah, as we picked it up, and I think just in the last few weeks from people's comments, I'm learning there's more use cases out there than we've necessarily seen. And we need to make sure that whilst our experiences, our practical experiences coming from the Miami project, but we're working on the standard as the standard in that kind of semi-voluntary capacity, we need to make sure others working on the standard kind of are equals in input into it. We have no special decision-making power over the standard.
And I'll chime in as well. Tim, thank you for taking up the pen. The standard needed some care and feeding to 1.1 and soon the 2.0 spec. I think your comments about is it safe to make breaking changes in 1.1 are correct. I think at least from my perspective, I'm not aware, and Greg, correct me if I'm wrong, I'm not aware of any implementations that are really tightly coupled to the 1.0 spec and however someone might have interpreted it, other than Ohana, those that have deployed Ohana. I think Ohana itself, as we've talked about, could benefit from some upgrading as well. That's another topic maybe for 2.0 when we start taking on the notion of having an API specification in HSDS. But that's another conversation. So as far as we're concerned, we actually now have essentially 3 implementations of HSDS and iCarol in various stages of development. One being the project Andrew was talking about, where the data is transformed into HSDS in their Azure instance and emitted through an API. And that was work that we facilitated in concert very closely with Andrew's organization. We also allow people to export their data into CSV files. And we have done coding to allow HSDS to be emitted from our own API, which has been in existence for several years, and now will support emitting HSDS. I'm not sure all 3 of those implementations agree with each other. So to wit, the spec could use some tightening, and that's where a lot of my comments are coming from. But internally, we're trying to at least get all 3 of our publications of HSDS data to be perfectly synchronized, and we're very close to that. But it just illuminates the gray area that exists in the spec and how it can be interpreted by different developers who are on the same team, let alone on different teams.
And in that, Neil, I'm guessing one of the open issues, and Greg stops if we're diving too deep, but is this question of kind of, yeah, how do you represent this in API output? Because at the moment, the spec describes how to generate a bundle of CSV files, but it doesn't describe how to structure API responses and so on. But it sounds like you've done quite a lot of work on that, that we should make sure we're feeding into as precedent to the documenting that more tightly.
Yeah, no, as soon as you start working with the API, both as creating the API itself as well as wanting to consume it, which we're also doing, our own API, you run into those questions immediately. I'll give you a simple one. If I'm requesting a service record through the API, what else should be emitted? what related tables? And you can go everything from none, just give me the service record, and I'll ask for the related tables one by one, to no, give me all the related tables. Give me all the locations linked to that service. Give me the parent organization, right? You can have a vast range of what you're going to include in the response, and there's many of those kinds of questions.
Yeah.
The other one is that HSDS is a great specification for data transfer, but if you actually want to write an application to consume it, it's highly normalized structure means you've got to do a lot of interpretation into what in the Microsoft world will be called the view model, to interpret all the links to locations and service at locations and everything, and to decide what you're going to display to the user. So I'll pause now because these are all bigger conversations left for 2.0, but it just to illuminate the need for us to get to the goal of true interoperability with whatever entities might choose to implement the specification.
So one question, and then I'll also have a little bit of more scene setting. Neil, for your CSV export, were you actually using the data package part of the specification, or did you not touch the JSON data package piece and you just did the CSV export?
The latter. Yeah, we didn't work with the data package. We referenced it periodically, but as recent AHAs have exposed, we were also looking at the documentation, which, as Tim rightly corrects, there are discontinuities between the documentation and the data package, and the important ones that we were depending on. So, you know, we would have loved to have just taken the data package, used the tool to convert it into a class library, and just emitted data, but it didn't quite get us there.
So there's some good news on this front, and I can let Tim fill in a little bit more of the gaps here. You know, the data package specification was itself another emerging standard promoted by the Open Knowledge Initiative, and we're in conversation with them directly. They have been improving their own spec and their own documentation and their own tooling, and they've offered some measure of assistance for us because I think they want to actually highlight this project as a great example of the data package in action. And so we've known that the sort of description of that in version 1.0 was not up to snuff on a number of fronts, and that's one of the main issues that I think we can expect to get addressed even now in 1.1. Hopefully, also including tooling for validation and maybe even transformation.
And that was very exciting to see as a component of the data package was validation, stronger typing of the data types, something I've wanted for a long time to improve interoperability. So that's great.
And one more piece from me, looking ahead, this is not yet public, but we've gotten a modest amount of funding to run specifically a project around developing a standardized open API specification. And that funding, conveniently, is probably going to kick off right around the time that the Open Data Services Co-op is closing its current work to 1.1. So while all of the answers to questions about how we're going to go from 1.1 to 2.0 are not in place, we at least have the starting point of how we're actually going to implement some of these things at the API level. And I'm sorry, my room keeps talking at me. Sorry. I just want to reiterate a little bit of the criteria for the changes that we're expecting to make between now and 1.1. Tim, I don't know if you want to just take that right off the bat, or I can sort of reiterate what we've already laid out, and then we can discuss if that's.
I think you go ahead, and I'll jump in.
Yeah. So I think we talked about it a little bit, but basically we're aiming here between 1.0 and 1.1 to address these inconsistencies in the spec, to clarify things that were maybe not fully clear, and in some instances we might make an addition if it's not a major architectural change. We're looking for changes that will help with the implementation, that will not seriously break existing implementations. And we're going to be pretty aggressively deferring hard issues past 1.1 on the roadmap to 2.0. That certainly doesn't mean that someone can't, do something on their end. And I think we encourage that. If there's something that we're not going to put into 1.1, but you just want to go ahead and do it, we'll learn from that over time. So with that said, we're already starting to see the agenda shape up in the Open Referral GitHub issues queue. And the timeline, as I understand it, is we're making immediate fixes to 1.0 currently and soliciting feedback and discussion about issues that are sort of outstanding. And then in January, Tim and company will develop a set of proposals that they'll bring forth, and we'll have the opportunity in January and February to discuss those proposals with an aim to have 1.1 ready to go by the end of February.
I think that captures it. I think what I'd be really keen to hear from, particularly Neil and Andrew and Devin, is any kind of milestones on your side, because I think you put the question about where this timeline is, because if there's ways we can make sure things fit, then I'm keen to do that. So whilst we may not have made the final decisions on what 1.1 is exactly looking like before that timeline, if there's particular features we should prioritize getting the proposal together for and getting towards consensus on, then guide us in that, and I'm really happy to make sure we're as responsive as we possibly can be.
Yeah, and I think anyone who is doing a project, and I'm now thinking about you, Andrew, where you're starting to have third parties build against how you've implemented the specification, and if any enhancements are positive for you or changes are potentially negative for you, that's the moment to kind of say, all right, guys, it's very important we get the spec done by XYZ date. So then we have time to accommodate those changes and deploy them so that our third parties are not getting jacked around.
Yeah, that's exactly right. It's Andrew. It's sort of for us, in some ways, the horse has left the barn. We have implemented HSDS, but because of a number of the gaps that we saw in 1.0, we've had to heavily modify. I think in a good way, though, the HSDS specification. In fact, iCarol Cherry Logic did that work. It's excellent work from our perspective, but now that we're onboarding other partners onto that specification or leveraging that specification, we'd have a very difficult time modifying any of the assets that we've generated as a result of the HSDS Plus specification. Having said that, if there are any positive developments that we really should embed into an upgrade specification, we certainly would do so. So our hope is that we can get aligned really quickly on this, and but I can tell you from a practical standpoint, it would be very difficult for us to go backwards on anything that didn't have a net benefit for us.
And is HSDS Plus the work you've done out there somewhere that we should be looking at as we're kind of, because when any modeling things come up, if you've already done the thinking to resolve them, obviously we should follow that precedent unless there's a reason not to.
Yeah, let me be clear on HSDS Plus. This is Charity Logic. They have done a significant amount of work. Neil and I have worked closely, and Neil's got an excellent team that worked on how to upgrade the specification for Ontario's needs specifically. I mean, we're driving it pretty heavy. We are using it now to push data out of iCarol into what we're sort of framing as a neutral shared repository of data to try and get around some of the political barriers around INR data sharing. So that repository now is being built. But the HSDS Plus is really Charity Logic's baby in many respects, but we're out there marketing it, and with Neil's permission, we're talking about sort of what that looks like underneath with the technical folks who have the capability to understand what that looks like.
Just to clarify, Charity Logic is the company that provides iCarol, just in case that was
correct. Thank you, Greg. We should have just named it consistently from the start. And we haven't per se documented it. I think, Tim, to your request, what we'll do as we're doing this internal vetting of the 3 implementations I mentioned, we'll try to perhaps get the HSDS Plus, a very informal name we've been using, a little better documented. Andrew, you're probably going to need it anyway to be able to have third parties consume the data. And then, I'll bring that back into the spec conversations as well.
Great. And insofar as things are shareable, we're always happy to have dumped upon us, whether it's one example JSON file, one example CSV file, because even those things just help us read. And what I'm really keen to make sure is, as we go forward over the next month or so, I don't go trying to solve problems that others have already solved, because there's always a risk I might try and do that in a different way. So anything, however rough and ready, that you're able to share, even if you need to share it under a kind of not for wider sharing basis, would be really handy.
Great, sounds good.
So just on a process point, my hunch here is that we're gonna see what Neil has, like, as Tim's going through the spec and he's like clearly flagging like issues that are either unresolved or going to need discussion or can be quickly addressed. We're also going to see what Neil has done over on iCarol's side, which has a live implementation in Ontario. And I think that the line is, we're hoping to get a lot of answers to open questions from that implementation that we might be ready to just like go ahead with. We'll sort of bring them into the queue and have people be able to like see them and respond to them. If there are any questions that come up along the way about something that has done on iCarol's side that any of the members of our community have issues with or questions with, it's likely that we will hold those for discussion past 1.0, for on the path to 2.0, rather than try to have some sort of big decision point in this phase. That doesn't mean, as I understand it, I'm hoping that that doesn't cause any problems on your end. It just gives you all some time to demonstrate potentially the value of your approach, and gives others time to maybe make counter proposals that we might deal with much later down the road. But we're hoping that everything works out great.
I guess I'm just curious. Is the plus version, is this an openly available? Is the intention to make this a open standard, or at least available under the same type of premise that an open standard would be?
Yeah, we're not particularly thinking about protecting it. I guess I'll start with dispelling the negative answer. My intention is to just actively work to have it incorporated into the mainstream specification. So, if you go on the GitHub issues discussion board, and a lot of my comments are driven by things that we've discovered and implemented in the so-called HSDS class implementation. And so then it's just a matter of if it gets accepted that way in the spec, then it's been mainstreamed. We don't want to fork.
Yeah.
And probably what we should do is just, well, we may continue to refer to it as HSDS Plus, but technically it's HSDS 1.0 with our own accommodations made to it.
Yeah, and I guess something we can certainly do and look at, and again, this might be something we look at the technical piece for 2.0, but we can start thinking about it is an extensions mechanism. So what we've done on the open contracting data standard, which is the biggest standard we maintain, is developed a whole kind of way of having an extensions repository where you can say, if you have this sort of contracting system or this sort of platform, here's the way to standardize that extra information. And by factoring those things out, they can be under their own licenses. They're not bound by the share-alike terms of the main standard. But it also gives a way for a community to say, we really care about this particular extra set of fields to come together to agree the standard for those extra things without that having to get tied up in the governance of the overall standard. So that may be, in the long run, I wouldn't necessarily think that's 2017, but it may be in the long run that's something HSDS needs, particularly if we discover there are these sub-communities who want to standardize on additional fields that matter for a particular kind of referral service or a particular country. I guess would be the other big context is there will be substantial national differences, I guess.
We will also be seeing that another project that is now funded but has not yet been publicly announced is with the field of civil legal service providers. I'll be overseeing a project in Florida, and there are several other implementations. We don't have those folks on this call, but there are a number of vendors from the space of civil legal service providers, and we do expect them to be developing an extension of the spec that is specific to the kinds of information that civil legal service providers use. So we'll be seeing that at least in one subdomain in addition to potential variation across countries.
And if I can throw in one other question, because I guess we've on the one hand got HSDS Plus, and then Devin, there's the work you've done on the kind of simplified, flattened out versions, and I'm keen to make sure if there's any learning from that should be feeding into the upgrade. As you know, we spend a lot of our time thinking about how to make structured data as flat as possible. But yeah, is there stuff we should be picking up during the upgrade process?
Dev? We might have lost Devin. He's on mute.
Hi, yeah. And from my perspective, it's very much like a tool-driven question. Like when you're working in kind of like these fast-paced environments where there aren't tools that have been designed specifically for this purpose, like in the humanitarian space, it's basically spreadsheets and Google Sheets. And so, you have significant limitations with the efficacy of that approach, which is why Airtable is such an exciting solution that I've certainly been propagating in the space, because it turns a multi-sheeted spreadsheet into something that actually can be genuinely useful for the type of data collection and delivery that's necessary for that use case, right? So instead of having a bunch of people trying to create data validation fields on columns and try to keep everything in order, Airtable just connects all the dots, which gives you this unbelievable flexibility to make an app, basically, something that feels like an app to people. And so, as the spec becomes more clear, I very much intend to make an Airtable version of it, the closest, approximate it as close as possible, and then push that out as a solution for the humanitarian, in the humanitarian field. And I think we could probably, get Airtable to, feature it on their little gallery, and maybe get a little leverage from them as kind of a technical provider that could be providing this type of solution, in a absolutely, as like a free spreadsheet, enhanced spreadsheet service, Yeah. And so, that's obviously, that's basically where I see the thing. I mean, from in real terms, people use spreadsheets kind of, but spreadsheets are so commoditized that no one really cares about a specific format, and at least that I've seen in this field. But Airtable can change that.
Cool. So, Tim, do you have a sense, sequencing-wise, of when it might be best for Devin to start that work of converting spec into an Airtable instance?
So I think it's a good question. There's some substantive. Sorry, go ahead. Oh no, I think it's just background. I think there's some substantive issues on the spec around removing some of the normalization. I think there's a general consensus that the current spec is slightly over-normalized in a few places. I think once that's removed, it becomes a lot easier to build out a small relational model, because then you're not trying to make relational lots of things, which it turns out aren't worth having as relational. I think there's also some thinking to do about to what extent some of the relational model is handling edge cases that you can leave out of a simplified version. So, for example, the normalization of phone numbers and contacts and languages and so on, there might be a way of collapsing that into a much simpler version. So I think there's a thought experiment to do on a can you get this into 4 or 5 tables at most to cater for simple use cases, and at that point build out an Airtable, because I don't think what we want to do is build out an example sort of spreadsheet manual entry version that's got 15 tables to fill in manually. So that I think, though, yeah, so I think during the 1.1, after the 1.1 would be the timing of that. But I think what we need to have in mind throughout, and maybe write up even more explicitly as an issue, and Devin, anything you wanted to write on this, or otherwise I'll try and do it when I next get a chance, on the use case for the very flat versions, which, just describing and making sure we have in mind the humanitarian context where someone's needing to throw together a resource directory really quickly in the field, and they just need a template to fill in by hand. It's not going into a complex system. But the advantage is, if we get this in a template that's HSDS compatible, we can combine it with stuff coming out of those more complex systems and even import it into them later on. And I think understanding that use case will help guide us.
All right. So we have about 15 minutes before the hour. If we want, we can end early. I'm all about that. But I want to go around and see if folks have questions or suggestions. I know coming out of this, we're expecting to get some documentation from Neil about HSDS Plus. And it would be great to see anything else from Andrew that might, and or Devin, that might show the work that you all have done or want to do in action. But I also want to create space for you all to have your own questions or suggestions for moving forward. And we can go one by one, unless somebody want to start?
I mean, I can start just because it's on the Airtable front. Yeah, the only thing I'd add is that you know, the way Airtable documents, you know, Airtables produce a API by default, and so when we're looking at API documentation conventions, you know, and API conventions in general, like how they work, that yeah, I think it would be good to kind of use you know, maybe not use exactly how Airtable does it, but keep in mind that, you know, if we're going for the flatter versions, that you know, the more compatible the API works in the spec for HSDS, the more compatible that is with Airtable, the easier it'll be to leverage that feature.
Okay, and do you have a question or suggestion for us operationally moving forward?
I mean, more broadly than that, you know, no.
Okay.
I mean, I don't know. No.
Well, thanks. I'm excited about some of the possibilities we're talking about. I think it makes a lot of sense. Neil, Andrew, you want to offer closing thoughts, suggestions, questions?
I guess I would just say I'm intrigued about the governance conversation. It was brought up in the early days of the spec. It'd be nice to see some tighter governance. You know, people who are kind of approved reviewers of the spec, or both to have that clear, I guess, authority, for lack of a better word, but also to make sure people participate. Hey, you're one of X people on this board of reviewers. Please show up and give your feedback to make sure we're inclusive. So.
Yeah, and similar to that note, it's Andrew, is we have moved ahead in the hopes, actually, it's probably the best way of framing it, that the standard would catch up and we'd be able to merge this into some sort of consolidated standard across several projects that I believe now are moving forward, including the Miami and the Ontario projects, and Neil's referenced a couple of others. I think time is of the essence, quite frankly. I think the farther that we get down this road without getting to agreement around what a next version of that standard looks like and really address some of the gaps in the initial standard, I think that we have the potential for these initial projects, and I think they're fairly significant projects, to really move us away from a common standard. So that's my biggest fear. We certainly, and one of the things that that Neil and I talked about, Neil was very, very supportive of this, is trying to really, and correct me if I'm wrong, Neil, but really driving this for the HSDS Plus with in mind that we would be able to contribute back and hopefully see the standard merge into one common standard in the future that we can all benefit from. So I think the intent is there, but without driving this forward quickly and with some strong governance and almost managed participation, I think we risk moving away from that sort of dream of having a common standard that we all work from.
And if I can just re-emphasize that point too, Andrew, you know, to decloak whatever motives you might think I do or don't have, my participation in this is solely to foster true interoperability, and the higher interoperability, the better, between disparate systems. And that helps us in so many scenarios. That helps Carol in so many scenarios, and it helps the industry. So that's where I'm coming from, and that's why you often see me making comments about tightening up the spec, getting better validation, because what good is a standard if it's not highly interoperable?
The other thing, Greg, I want to mention maybe to the others on the line as well, is that I would say, and I will speak on behalf of Neil, because he's taken on some risk in the industry and enforcing or trying to advocate really towards a common standard. This is not being an easy battle. And on my side, working with service providers and those who benefit from the use of data as well, there's some risks. So we've sort of gone out there and sort of advocated for a standard that we're hoping can sort of stand the test of time, because that'll be really important if at the end of the day we get others to follow us, because I think in some ways we're trailblazing, Neil in the industry, me on the service provision side, but at some point we'll lose steam if we're not able to demonstrate progress on the standard.
Well, I commend you all for your leadership. I certainly know that it is a risk that you've taken, and I think I think we all see that there's potentially a lot of payoff to this risk. And the good news is that I do think we have a fair amount of ability to assess existing implementations and promote what seems to be working in the field. So let's use Tim and Co.'s time during the next, let's see, 2 to 3 months as well as we can. If we can get as much documentation and as much, sort of examples as possible from you all, both I think in a raw form to Tim and Co., but also if we're able to start addressing the individual changes that you've made and start identifying them within the repository as either issues or pull requests. Like I think you should probably feel free to just make pull requests, and we'll have a period in which we're able to discuss those. But that period is going to be right now during the holiday season and during the new year. And so to your benefit, you're putting something out there, and unless somebody really, really has a problem with it, I think we should expect smooth sailing. So, Tim, I think you're talking, but you're on mute.
Yeah, as we've been on this call to confirm that some of the meetings we had early January that took us out of the country are off. So I think it is the first 2 weeks of January will be the time when I'm suddenly at my desk really trying to work through this. So yeah, throw CSV files, JSON files, other things our way, rough and ready notes, and we'll really work through those to get some good proposals. And I think, Andrew, you're right that we've got to make sure this takes that next step forward. There's been some really solid groundwork laid, but it's kind of definitely now is the time to move it forward.
Okay, y'all. Unless there's any other thoughts, or Tim and Rob, I want to give you the chance to ask any questions of these guys. We have a few minutes left. If there's anything that you're puzzling over in the repo that would benefit from some real time chat. But if we're good, we can let everybody go before the top of the hour.
I think, yeah, I'm just really keen to see examples of any API stuff that's been done or any extended schemas so that I can understand what the issues there have been. So that's my key kind of ask.
Mm-hmm. And I know you all were going back and forth on the taxonomy stuff. It looked like it was getting deep in there for a little bit.
Yes, it would be great to see what's currently happening on that. We're trying to get our heads around Ohana's implementation of taxonomy and realizing it, as you've said, Neil, it doesn't quite get there. Mm-hmm. So I think, yes. Any thoughts on how we balance the complexity versus simplicity of taxonomy would be great. But I think I owe you a reply in that thread.
Yeah, no, maybe I went overboard in specking it out, but it is, for the more complex INRs out there, they need the complexity, but I can totally appreciate, a developer new to the space would look at that and might walk the other way, thinking, oh, it's just too much. So.
I guess one of the things we've done in other standards is split things like that into two fields. So you have almost a simple field and a detail field. So you say, so we could talk about something where, I guess I need to sit down and write in response to that thread, but it may be that something to explore is what does it look like to have a top taxonomy term and then the full taxonomy string. And I guess then one of my questions, and I'm aware in this space there is some proprietary stuff like Ayres taxonomy and other things out there that are sort of open secrets of proprietary, not proprietary. No one's entirely clear as far as I can tell, or maybe it is clear, but I've not got my head around it. But are things like that syntax of service term times other term, is there a risk that some things like that are proprietary, or are we relatively safe drawing on things like that?
No, those are widely used in the Ayres world.
Yeah.
So that the question then becomes for the spec, to what degree do we want to incorporate that widely used approach in the Ayres world versus outside of the Ayres world, which is also plentiful. being confused or bewildered by that. That's the open question, I suppose. But the linking of terms is supported, as far as I know, by most, if not all, of the major INR software providers in the ERS world.
Yep.
All right.
Great. Well, thanks for convening, Greg.
Thank you all. I'm very excited about where we go from here. I'll be sharing this link back out to the group so anybody who so desires can watch. But yeah, let's get to work.
Good stuff. Thank you all.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye now.
Bye, thanks.